Mr. Liang Eng Hua.
Question 5, sir.
Speaker, sir, with your permission, can I take questions 5 and 6 together, please?
Yes, please.
CPI, all items, inflation picked up to 2.5% on a year-on-year basis in Q3 2021 from 2.3% in Q2. The rise in domestic inflation came largely on the back of higher external inflation due to increases in global energy and food commodity prices and persistent supply bottlenecks in key global industries and transport hubs. On the energy front, crude oil prices have risen to above US $80 per barrel since early October on account of the decision by OPEC Plus to keep supply increases modest, even as oil demand continues to pick up due to the global economic recovery and the rally in global natural gas prices. Higher oil and gas prices in turn will translate to higher energy prices domestically, and about 95% of our electricity is currently generated using natural gas. That's on the energy front. On the food front, global prices for food commodities, such as cereals and vegetable oil, have also risen due to supply constraints arising from weather-related disruptions, manpower, labor shortages, and export restrictions in key food-producing countries, amidst rising global demand. So higher global food prices will in turn naturally exert upward pressure on domestic food prices. Meanwhile, supply bottlenecks for goods such as semiconductors and congestions at ports around the world have contributed to a rise in the prices of imported consumer goods in Singapore. Domestically, we expect labor costs to rise as the labor market continues to recover and border restrictions limit non-resident worker inflow. We also expect to see inflation in accommodation to persist due to strong rental demand for housing amidst construction delays caused by labor shortages in the construction sector. Against this backdrop, our CPI all items inflation is projected to come in at around 2% this year and average around 1.5% to 2.5% in 2022. But despite this rise in inflation, Singapore's economic recovery for the year remains on track. Barring a major setback in the global economy, GDP growth is expected to come in between 6 to 7% for the full year, mainly supported by outward-oriented sectors such as manufacturing, finance and insurance, and the information and communication sectors. The government recognizes that higher inflation is a cause of concern for Singaporeans, particularly those in low-income households. To manage the cost of living pressures faced by Singaporeans, our government adopts a multi-pronged approach. First, in view of external and domestic cost pressures, MAS recently announced a shift towards an appreciating path for the trade-weighted Singapore dollar, the Singapore dollar nominal effective exchange rate. A strong Singapore dollar will help to mitigate imported inflation and temper domestic costs to ensure price stability over the medium term. That's one. Second, the government strives to maintain and manage domestic supply-side constraints, and these include the supply of industrial and commercial spaces to help moderate business costs increases and reduce the knock-on impact on consumer prices. During the pandemic, the government has also disbursed rental relief to help businesses cope with their rental costs. In addition, policy measures such as the Wage Credit Scheme, the Jobs Support Scheme, and the Jobs Growth Incentive Scheme provide some support for businesses in terms of their manpower and labor costs. Third, to mitigate the impact of rising global food prices, the government has diversified our food import sources to help ensure that the prices of our food supplies remain competitive. Fourth, we will continue to pay particular attention to Singaporeans from lower income households who need support for their basic living expenses. The government will continue to provide assistance through ComCare and the permanent GST voucher scheme And from time to time, the government also introduces one-off support measures, such as the Budget 2020 Grocery Voucher Scheme. In addition, Singaporeans from lower to middle income households who have experienced involuntary job loss or income loss due to the economic impact of COVID-19 can apply for financial assistance provided through schemes such as the COVID-19 Recovery Grant and the Courage Fund. The government will continue to monitor inflation and cost of living pressures closely and adjust our policies where necessary.
Mr. Saktiandi Supat.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank MOS for his detailed answers. I have just one SQ and somewhat related to question number 5 as well. Can MOS give, beyond the mitigation measures that MOS mentioned just now, which I'm very thankful for in terms of support for expenses and other mitigation measures, give an update on other preemptive efforts? For example, the Retail Price Watch Group, or RPWG. An update on that would be quite useful because almost slightly more than a decade ago, we created that to keep a watch on retail prices and address concerns on any alleged profiteering and excessive pricing of daily necessities and food items. And I think about the role of cooperation with retailers going forward as a price stabilizer. I think that element of preemptive efforts might be useful at this point in time as we proceed into 2022. If we can have further updates, please, MAS. Thank you.
Supplementary question. The government maintains a very strong vigilant stance on prices increases and price fluctuations. The Retail Price Watch Group that the member mentioned has stood down, but we have other measures and other ways of monitoring the price of goods. So for daily necessities, consumers can make use of CASE's Price Kaki app to compare prices of groceries and hawker food to help them to make more informed purchasing decisions. And to also help Singaporeans cope with higher prices for their daily necessities, the government continues to work with cooperatives such as NTUC Fair Price and community support programs such as the price freezes on essential items under their house brand over the period of March 2019 to December 2020. But as I mentioned earlier on, I wanted to just reinforce that it is a whole multi-pronged approach, a broad and expansive approach that the government is taking to tackle inflation. We've mentioned earlier on MAS's monetary policy adjustments, the government managing supply-side constraints, which is not unique to Singapore but globally. Third is to diversifying food import sources and energy sources over the long term, as we have debated in the House for the last 2 days. And of course, our particular focus and assistance to lower-income households, including, for example, USAVE vouchers for households living in 4-room or smaller HDB flats to help them with utility bills. So our approach has been multi-pronged. Our approach has been wide and expansive and broad to help our people to cope with inflation. Thank you.
Mr. Liang Eng Hua.
Sir, the MOS mentioned about the monetary policy as one of the very important tools to fight imported inflation. So I'd like to ask MOS whether is there further scope for our strong Sing dollar to mitigate the imported inflation, given that it does impact our export competitiveness, whether from our trade consideration standpoint, is there further room for that to use to mitigate imported inflations? Secondly, besides imported inflation, we are also faced with domestic cost pressures. I think the MOS also mentioned about the push for higher wages, the additional measures from the COVID-related safe management procedures that the businesses got to follow, and also the energy prices and others. My concern is whether all these upward pressures on costs will lead to businesses pricing in this anticipated increase in costs, and therefore will create a spiral in inflation. So I'd like to ask the MOS whether would there be how the government is going to manage this, whether there will be interventions, and also for items that are outside the CPI baskets, how are we going to mitigate those costs as well, cost increase as well?
Thank the member for his supplementary question. As we all know, inflation is a clear and present issue confronting and vexing economists, particularly this week, particularly central bankers as well as policymakers. If you look at it, US consumer price inflation is at 5.4%, highest in 13 years. South Korea just announced that it had inflation hit a high, 10-year high in October as well. The MAS, as I earlier updated, was it had already made a decisive move on October 14 by raising the slope of the Singapore dollar nominal effective exchange rate. And it had also said that it would continue to track the growth and inflation trajectories over the next few quarters. This is one tool in the toolbox. There are many others, and maybe I just share with the member how we are dealing with the inflationary issues. If you look at the thing as a whole, this issue has been more acute because of two major challenges. The first is that the supply side constraints, and the second is the economic rebound. So the supply side constraints have been in place pre-COVID, but accentuated during COVID. The economic pickup will lead to pent-up demand, economic rebounding, and so you have huge demand, but then continued supply constraints. But if you look at what's happening right now, despite all of these input prices, our exports, in fact, have seen a very strong recovery this year. Our non-oil domestic exports increased 9.1% year-on-year in Q3 21, following the 10.1% expansion in 2Q 21. So this NODX growth, in fact, in third quarter of 21, was driven mainly by exports of non-electronic products such as specialized machinery, petrochemicals, and pharmaceuticals. So when our exports are strong, it means also that when our export performances are strong, it also means that our exports remain competitive in the international markets. And we must keep these markets open so that our goods can flow out, and it also manages a hedge against other price increases inbound. How do we do so? Well, member knows that we have undertaken a whole slew and suite of major trade facilitation and multilateral frameworks such as RCEP, CPTPP. It builds upon our existing FTAs with major trade partners representing 85% of global GDP. At the same time, the other way to manage this is to ensure that our supply chains remain connected. And that means diversifying our import and export markets. We have and are negotiating and successfully concluded negotiations on the Pacific Alliance Singapore Free Trade Agreement. It is another arrow in our quiver such that we can open up new markets for our exports to alleviate, again, inflationary pressures. We will also continue to support local enterprises so they can deepen their export capabilities, seize opportunities in the global economy, and ensure our export remain relevant and competitive in the international market in the long term. The other aspects to reduce inflationary pressures include also the supply of industrial and commercial spaces to help moderate business costs and reduce the knock-on impact on consumer prices. And these also include measures such as reducing rental relief to help business cope with their rental costs and hopefully have knock-on effects to consumers as well. Thank you.